All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Robert, and I'm serving as the interim dean for the Trulaske College of Business. We're very pleased to host Dr. Jim Bullard for this talk this morning. And on behalf of the Trulaske College of Business and our co-host, the Office of Extension and Engagement, the School of Journalism, and the Department of Economics, I'd like to welcome everybody to this event. I'd also like to give special recognition to our co-host, the Center for Economic and Financial Management, and particularly Graham McCauley and Marco Pantoja and Andrew Zumwalt for their hard work in putting this event together and for their financial support. So let's please give them a round of applause. It's really terrific to see such great representation at this event from our local community and business leaders, as well as the University of Missouri. And let's do more of these events in the future. I think this is terrific. I'd like to ask Dr. Joe Haslag from the Department of Economics to come up and introduce Dr. Bullard. I understand that Joe has known Dr. Bullard for some time, so let's give him a round of applause.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know how excited you must be to hear my mostly rambling 37-minute introduction of Jim. I've had the great pleasure and the great fortune of knowing Jim for a long time. He's much younger than I am, obviously. So he was just a wee lad when we met 30 some odd years ago. Jim's the 12th president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So over 100 years, they've been keeping guys around for quite some time. It's just impressive. Jim was a phenomenal scholar when we started going to conferences together. I always learned a lot from Jim's talks. He was doing some amazing work on kind of helping us understand how expectations were formed, how these learning mechanisms affected the macroeconomy. He went on to study, obviously, monetary economic issues as well, policy issues. He's just done a phenomenal amount of scholarly work and has been just a great leader for the Federal Open Market Committee and for the 8th Federal Reserve District here for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. I'm not going to talk for 37 minutes because what you want to hear is our honored guest. And it's a great privilege for me to introduce to you Dr. James Bullard.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And thanks for being here this morning. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion of Fed policy and where we're at. I'm afraid this is going to be a geeky talk for early in the morning. The clock says it's only 7 o'clock. So I'm going to get my water here. But, it's a pleasure to be here and we'll get to questions. This is going to be really about a topical issue in financial markets about where we are with monetary policy, and it is a critical juncture, I would say, for U.S. monetary policy and global monetary policy because we have a lot more inflation than we're used to, and we're having to re-educate ourselves and the financial community and the public at large about what inflation means and what we have to do to keep it under control. And so I would see this talk as part of that process. The phrase behind the curve is going to be in quotes here a lot. This is something that often gets said, but what does it really mean? And so we'll try to put some definition around it here in this talk. I have two different interpretations, as the title says. One is kind of unfriendly to the Fed, and the other one's a little more friendly to the Fed. So see what you think about this. So first of all, U.S. inflation is exceptionally high, and that doesn't mean 2.1% or 2.2% or something. This means, comparable to what we saw in the high inflation era in the 1970s and early 1980s. And I'll have a chart to talk about this a little bit. So the second bullet point gives the punchline based on the first interpretation, which is that even if you're very generous to the Fed in interpreting what the inflation rate really is today and how persistent it is today, it's a calculation that I'm going to do is going to say that you'd have to raise the policy rate a lot. Okay, so that's the first interpretation. I think a lot of people in financial markets are looking at the numbers and saying, they're kind of thinking the second bullet point here. However, this is a different era of central banking than it was in the 1970s. That's a long time ago. Culture was a lot different around financial markets and around monetary policy. We have a lot more credibility. We have an inflation target, and we have forward guidance. Forward guidance was not something that was around. So forward guidance means that you don't actually do anything, but markets think you are going to do something. And so you get the pricing before the action actually occurs. If you take account of that, we don't look so bad. So we're not as far behind the curve. So not all hope is lost. And so this is the basic gist of this story. So I'm going to throw around a lot of numbers here, but this is a basic point. So I just have 2 slides here on the real side of the economy. Most of this is about inflation, but basically the U.S. economy is still doing very well. We had a banner year in 2021. Output in the U.S. is at the pre-pandemic trend line. We're past the pre-pandemic peak and on the trend line. The committee, the FOMC, which I'm on, thinks the median member thinks that the economy will grow at a 2.8% rate in this year. And that's even with a weak first quarter. If you pay attention to these numbers, it looks like Q1 economic growth will be slow, but people are attributing that to the war in Ukraine and to Omicron. So probably the second quarter will be much stronger. Third quarter will be much stronger as you get more reopening, more fading of the pandemic. So basically, the real side of the economy, you're talking about above trend growth because the trend growth rate in the U.S. economy is only 2% or 1.75%. So if you're going to have strong growth this year, then that means labor markets are going to continue to improve, and labor markets are already the best they've been in a generation. Unemployment has fallen to 3.6%. I think the unemployment rate is going to fall below 3% this year. And this hasn't happened since the 1950s. So it's a great time. If you know people that need a job, great time to tell them to get out there and get a good match and set them up for their future. Many more job openings than unemployed people. Just a lot of things looking really good about the U.S. Labor market. And finally, this is not an old expansion. So it's not like, oh, well, this has been going on for 10 years. Our luck must be about to run out. Recession must be around the corner. That's not what's going on here. This is a relatively new expansion bursting out of the pandemic. So I think you've got plenty of potential to have this run for many years going forward. So here's the labor market conditions index by our friend and rival bank on the other side of Missouri here. But this, I like this one because it takes all kinds of different aspects of labor market performance and puts them into one number. That's the blue line in this figure. This goes back to 2006. The shaded areas are recessions. So you can see the pandemic recession there on the right-hand side. It was short, only a couple months long, and labor market conditions plunged, but they've rocketed back up in the last 2 years, and you're actually above the pre-pandemic level and actually at the 1990s level. The late 1990s was considered the best labor market in the post-war era. So this is going to go even higher, and you're going to have the best labor market in the post-war era very soon here. So I'm going to talk mostly about inflation, though, in this talk, and I want to get to this point that inflation is comparable to what it was in the 70s already, right now, as we sit here today. So one thing you can look at to measure inflation is so-called core personal consumption expenditures inflation. That's the one that throws out food and energy. Don't throw tomatoes at me. Yeah, that's the one that throws out food and energy. Because the thought is that the energy prices, go up and down, and maybe we shouldn't be counting that when we're just trying to get a sense of the underlying inflation rate. And right now that number is 5.4%. And there have been only two other times since 1960 when this measure of inflation has been close to this level, and that was 1974 and 1983. So here's a picture. It goes all the way back to 1960. The gray bars are the recessions over this time period. The blue line is core PC inflation measured from 1 year ago. And we took a horizontal red line here at today's value, which is 5.4. And you go back on the left-hand side of this picture, and you only cross the blue line twice. That was in 1974 and in 1983. So now if you look at this picture, you see that after 1974, core inflation didn't go down. It went up. And it stayed high, went all the way up to 10%, went down again, went up to 10% again. There were 3 recessions during that period. So that's the dark days of inflation, the post 1974 period. The other period, the 1983 period, you can see inflation went down after that period and never came back above this red dotted line. So what was the difference between 1974? The policy in 1974 and the policy in 1983. Well, the policy in 74 was that the committee liked to blame lots of other factors for inflation. They liked to point to other things that were causing inflation other than the monetary policy. They liked to say that certain prices were going up and they were going to come back down. They kept the policy rate very low, relatively low. The ex post real interest rate, the one that adjusts for inflation, was negative, very negative during this time. And what did they get out of this policy? They got this high inflation and rising inflation in the second part of the 1970s and the early part of the 1980s. And you had inflation never coming below 5.4% on this measure for a decade. But the surprising thing about the 70s was not just that you're tolerating higher inflation, but that the real economy was also volatile. You had lots of recessions during this period. Why is that? It's because inflation's messing up the price signals that the economy is trying to send. Firms aren't quite sure how much they should be producing because they're not quite sure how much they're going to be able to charge for their product. People aren't quite sure if they should take this job or that job because they're not quite sure what the real wage is. They see higher nominal wages. These things are bouncing around. All these prices are changing all the time. So this just kind of messes up the signals that should be sent in a market-based economy. The 1983 committee had a very different view. They were also looking at a core inflation rate, just like today, of about 5.5%. But they had a different approach to monetary policy. They talked about the central bank being responsible for inflation. They kept the policy rate relatively high. Ex post real interest rates were quite high in this period, so high that I think today's analysts would have predicted that there would be a recession right around the corner in 1984, 1985. None of that happened. The subsequent experience was that core inflation was below 5.4% for 40 years after 1983. And the 80s expansion was very powerful and went on for almost a decade. And then you had the 1990-91 recession. And then after that, you had a long expansion as well. So these two experiences convinced a lot of people that it was important to avoid getting, quote, behind the curve. I guess it's an engineering term. I don't know if we have some engineers here. It's like you come around the corner, the train comes around the corner and it's too fast and then tumbles off the track. So that's where this behind the curve came from. And I'm going to talk about behind the curve in these remaining slides here. So the first interpretation of this behind the curve is starts with the idea that we have a statutory mandate. It's in the law. That we should provide stable prices in the U.S. economy. Associated with that, we have an inflation target. The inflation target is stated in terms of headline inflation. So the food and energy is in there. And we're supposed to keep that index stable at 2%. That's the way we've interpreted it. It was 6.4% in February. So we're way off. We're missing our target by 440 basis points here, a miss that we haven't seen in 40 years. Some might say, well, gosh, war in Ukraine and all kinds of other things going on. Maybe we should throw out the food and energy, at least for now. If you do that, you get this 5.4% number. And then if you're willing to do something a little more extreme, which is the Dallas Fed trim mean, so this takes the distribution of all price changes and throws out the low ones and throws out the high ones. So you're throwing out a lot of stuff here. But if you're willing to do that, you will get only 3.6% inflation based on that measure. So here's a picture that shows all of these and really shows how much inflation we've got just in the last year. This goes back to 2017, the recession, the pandemic recession is there in the gray. And all three of these measures have moved up off of 2%. Look how close we were to 2% in the grand old days of 2017 to 2019. So this is a completely different era here in the last year. So what I'm going to do, the point of this, showing this picture with these three lines, the top line is the headline inflation, the gold line is the core inflation, the black line is the Dallas Fed trim mean. I'm going to be very generous and kind to the Fed here, since I work for the Fed. And I'm going to choose the low line here. I'm going to say it's only 3.6%. So I'm going to do everything based on this minimal idea of the persistent component of inflation. But the point is going to be, even being very generous in interpreting current inflation, we're still behind the curve. So that's what this says. I'm going to use the most generous or lowest interpretation of the persistent component inflation. That will give us this minimal degree to which the Fed is behind the curve. And we're just going to keep in mind that we're using this minimal definition of inflation, and you could use the other definitions. And if you did, we'd be further behind the curve. So I'm going to do Taylor type monetary policy rules. John Taylor's at Stanford University. He developed so-called monetary policy rules 30 years ago now. What's good about these rules is you can stick in some numbers and you can get an actual recommendation for where the policy rate should be today. And then we'll compare that recommended policy rate to where we actually are. And if we're too low, that's going to be behind the curve. Just so you know, the policy rate, for those of you that don't follow this very closely, has been very close to zero. And we only raised 25 basis points at our most recent meeting. So we're only at about 1/3 of 1% on the policy rate. So in this Taylor type rule calculation, I'm not going to dwell on this, but you need a couple of ingredients. One is whatever the short-term real interest rate is. I'm going to be super generous here and say that it's minus 50 basis points. That's a very low number in this game. That is not too far off from what it was pre-pandemic in February of 2020. So we'll be generous and we'll give us that number. And then you need a number that describes how aggressively the policymaker is going to react to deviations of inflation from target. If that number is bigger than 1, then you're doing the right thing. So I'm going to give the lowest value, a low value, but still bigger than 1.25. And then you need a parameter that's describing how much you're going to react to, let's say, the deviations of unemployment from the natural rate of unemployment. I'm going to put 0 on that because we're already below what the committee thinks the natural rate of unemployment is. And our new framework says that we don't have to worry about that part anymore after we get, as long as it's low enough. And so these are super generous assumptions. All right, so let's do our little math there, a little math problem at 8:15 in the morning. And I know you can do this in your head. Comes out to 3.5%. So what does that mean? This Taylor rule calculation is telling us that where we should be at under minimal assumptions, very generous assumptions, it's saying it should be at 3.5%. Where we actually only 1/3 of 1% or 37.5 basis points. So you're too low by about 300 basis points, according to this calculation. So I think that's what a lot of the financial markets are looking at. Maybe a lot of you are looking at and saying, looks like you guys are way behind the curve. and 300 basis points is a lot in this game. And so I think this is kind of a interesting baseline calculation. And then we're going to keep in mind that if I used headline inflation, or if I used a higher value for this real interest rate, you'd get even a bigger number here. You'd be even farther behind the curve. So this is part of the process, I think, of sort of re-educating ourselves and other people that are interested in monetary policy or experiencing inflation, and what has to be done to keep inflation under control. Now, before I leave you in depression, all is not lost. So I'm going to give you a second interpretation of behind the curve that's going to be more generous to where the Fed is. So the difference between today and the 1970s is that central banks have a lot more credibility. In the 70s, no one believed that the Fed would ever do anything about inflation. It was kind of a chaotic era. You really needed Volcker to come in, and Volcker was a very powerful figure in central banking, and he slayed the inflation dragon and established credibility. So after that, then people believed that the central bank would keep inflation under control, but he had to establish that credibility. So we're benefiting from Tall Paul's, he was very tall, you know, Tall Paul's credibility enhancement of the Fed. And then we also do forward guidance. So we do a lot more in the Bernanke in particular. I would give a lot of credit to having a lot more transparency around the Fed, not so secretive. Go ahead, talk about where policy is, talk about where the economy is, and then markets anticipate that they can kind of see where policy is going. That's called forward guidance. And there's been a lot of forward guidance since last November, when the inflation numbers really spiked up in the US, and people started to understand that the Fed was going to have to get a lot more hawkish. So this has been a key factor in market pricing, and you guys might be familiar with some of these numbers. This chart goes back to the pre-pandemic era. The gold line is the 2-year Treasury yield. The blue line is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which has gone up just 100 basis points in just recent weeks here. And is getting close to 5%. So, you know, these are some key rates in markets. The 2-year Treasury is kind of the short end of the yield curve, short-term borrowing, and then the mortgage market obviously is longer-term borrowing, and both these are up sharply. So the Fed has barely lifted a finger, right? We just made 25 basis point move, but look, gosh, this is up. These are up 150 to 200 basis points. And these are kind of the key numbers that where the trading is actually occurring. So this is forward guidance. So the Taylor rule calculation said we're supposed to be at 3.5%. And if you're willing to say that we'll take the 2-year Treasury as a representation, not just of what the Fed has done already, but also what it's likely to do in the future and what markets are anticipating, you'd get maybe a better idea of the current stance of monetary policy. So the 2-year Treasury yield is moving a lot in recent trading. It's 2.43%. So you'd only be 100 basis points off of the Taylor rule recommendation. So you're still behind the curve, but not as much as it looks. It looks like we've barely lifted a finger, but actually this number has moved quite a bit. So, and also when you give forward guidance, you're saying we're going to do something in the future. You have to follow through and actually do that. So you would need it doesn't absolve the Fed from having to do anything, but it just means that the tighter policy is partly already in markets and already having effect today. So to the extent we're going to be able to keep inflation under control, it's because some of this is already occurring right now in the first half of 2022. You don't have to wait until the actual policy rate gets up higher in the second half of 2022. But we're still behind the curve. And in particular, you know, I've been very generous in assumptions. If you had a higher value for R star, you'd be farther behind. If you had other definitions, broader definitions of inflation, headline inflation, you'd be much farther behind. Still behind the curve. So that's my story. So I hope you've enjoyed my story. These other slides are kind of extra slides that comment on a few things. And I think in our Q&A, you may want to talk about many other things that I haven't talked about here this morning. But I just thought I'd highlight a few risks here. One risk is that inflation expectations will become embedded in the economy, and then inflation starts to be very hard to get rid of once it gets embedded. The theory says that expectations of inflation are supposed to be very highly correlated with actual inflation. So these actual inflation numbers are a backward-looking thing. It's like, how much inflation did we have over the last year? The inflation expectations that are measured in markets are a forward-looking thing. How much inflation are we going to have over the next 5 years? These, according to theory, these are supposed to be tightly correlated. And I've got a picture here. The problem is, this picture demonstrates that they are pretty highly correlated. The correlation is about 2/3 here between these actual inflation and expected inflation. The blue line is the forward-looking 5-year break-even inflation rate that markets have, traders have. And then the actual inflation is the core PCE inflation rate measured from 1 year ago. So that's a backward-looking thing. You might think these things wouldn't have to be that closely related, but they are closely related. But look at the right-hand part of this chart. This goes all the way back to 2003, but the right-hand part of this chart is the current data. Actual inflation has gone way up, and expected inflation is still a little bit lower. And that still reflects that the Fed has quite a bit of credibility that will be able to bring inflation down. But you don't really want to see this blue line going up to where the gold line is, because that would indicate that inflation expectations have become embedded in the economy. And then you're dealing with lots of inflation all the time, year after year, as we were in the 1970s. Inflation, by the way, is very hard, as you guys know, on low and moderate income households, salaried households, people that don't have a lot of investments. Wages tend not to keep up with inflation, so they're just poorer because of the inflation. So it's very tough on lower end of the income distribution. What about the yield curve? A lot of chatter in financial, maybe we'll get a question here. A lot of chatter in financial markets about the inverted yield curve. It's actually not inverted in the last couple of days here, so it uninverted on us. It means that the 10-year yield is less than the 2-year yield. I would say there are a couple factors that are keeping 10-year yields somewhat lower than they would otherwise be. For one thing, our policy, we still have a really big balance sheet. We are going to run off the balance sheet now. That should release some of the pressure on the long end of the curve and allow longer rates to come up. We've got an environment where we're expecting slower real growth in the future than we have today. That's because we grew so fast coming out of the pandemic. Of course, we're going to slow down to some trend pace of growth, but that doesn't mean it's a recession. It just means you're not going to grow at 5%, for a long time. Eventually you're going to slow down to 2%. So that's going to flatten the curve. We've also got lower inflation expected in the future compared to today. We got this burst of inflation today. I'm telling you, we're going to keep it under control. And so that means that inflation will go back to our 2% target in the future. So that's going to flatten the yield curve. There's also a flight to safety from the war in Ukraine and associated events. So I think there are reasons to think that the 10-year, as these factors abate, that the 10-year would rise. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there are, of course, risks to the growth forecast here that I've given. We've got this war going on, obviously, that will have some impact on the U.S., but will have a bigger impact on Europe. Europe is one of the biggest economies. Take it all together, is actually bigger than the U.S. economy. So it would matter a lot if Europe went into recession. So we'll see how they're able to cope and deal with the situation. Obviously, it's in the headlines every day. You've got global energy markets being impacted. The only thing I would say about that is that we have seen $100 oil here in the US between 2011 and 2014, it did not cause a recession in the US. So you've got other things to consider. Oil stocks aren't what they used to be in the US because we have so much more production in the US than we used to have. So it's not just a one-way hit consumers with the oil shock, go into recession, hit the US with an oil shock. Some people are hurt, but other people are helped. So it's not so clear what the impact will be there. I think I haven't talked about the pandemic, but it looks like the Omicron wave is continuing to fade. And it looks like vaccines are holding up. So it looks like we'll get continuing fading of the pandemic as we get more and more used to the idea that it's an endemic disease instead of a pandemic disease. And then I think that should allow more reopening in the second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter of 2022. So that's a bullish factor, I think, for 2022. So let me finish here and let's open it up to questions. This just restates what I said about the two interpretations. The first interpretation says that the Fed is not kind to me and my colleagues, but says that we're way behind the curve. The second interpretation says that we can take some heart from the forward guidance that has been given and that we're maybe not as far behind as you think, and we will be able to keep inflation under control going forward. So I'm going to stop there. And thanks very much for having me this morning and a very enjoyable audience. I'm looking forward to your questions.
So at this stage, let me just say Andrew and Graham are going to carry microphones around. You're free to ask questions. I'm going to urge you, or almost beg you, maybe is a better way to say, please make it a question rather than pontificating on your particular worldview, and let Jim do most of the talking. Thanks. Very good, Jim.
Do we have any questions over here?
Can you give us some insight as to the chairman's role in influencing policy over the rest of the FOMC?
Sure. The chair is Jay Powell. He's been in the role for, I guess, 4 years, and now is on the verge of getting approval in the Senate to be chair for the next 4 years. The committee at full strength is a pretty large committee. It's 19 people. And man, they all have different views. So the chair's job is to marshal the committee and rally around a consensus point of view. And I think Jay does a very good job at that. So, but the chair has to stay in the middle of the committee and take into account all the different views that are being expressed. I think it's a strength to have a big committee because you do get representation from all over the country on these important issues. You get some input from here in Missouri, but you also get input from Wall Street and Atlanta and California, and bring that all together and consider all the arguments and then come to a good policy. He also has to speak for the committee. I only speak for myself as an individual member of the committee. It's only the chair that speaks for the committee as a whole. He gets to go to Capitol Hill too, which is really fun.
With all the excess liquidity in the banking system, how long do you think it takes market rates to sort of catch up with what the Fed's doing?
Well, I think markets are pretty good at anticipating. But we do have a really big balance sheet at this point. Is that what you mean by that liquidity? Yeah, we have I haven't talked about balance sheet here, but the Fed's balance sheet at the beginning of the pandemic was around 4 trillion. That's trillion with a T. And now it's closer to 9 trillion. So just a gigantic amount of bond purchases that went on. And that was, deliberately undertaken to keep lower long-term interest rates. So, but now we've stopped purchasing and we're about to start runoff at a coming meeting. So That should release some of the pressure on longer term rates and allow them to come up a little bit faster. I see markets where pricing 10-year yield somewhat higher this morning and in recent days. So I think there's a lot going on in the monetary policy world. It's kind of funny in a way that there was so little volatility between 2011 and 2019. You had this kind of slow motion molasses kind of economy in many ways, and now you've got these big moves are occurring, on a daily basis, way up, way down. So way more volatility than we're used to in financial markets. But I think that reflects everyone getting used to the idea that, oh my gosh, we're going to have to do a lot here to keep inflation under control, and we're going to have to reprice a lot of financial instruments that are out there, and that's going to cause a lot of volatility. So that's where we are right now.
My question would be, with your comments, I assume you feel that 2% unemployment is basically or virtually full employment. Yet on the other hand, we see all kinds of businesses reducing hours because of lack of help that they can hire or closing their doors, et cetera. Any comments?
Yeah, I think that's a stunning phenomenon of the pandemic and this post-pandemic world, is that some businesses just weren't able to reopen at all because the cost of the labor just made it not a feasible business anymore. So, but that's a reflection of a very strong labor market. There are plenty of jobs that are being offered, and well in excess of the number of unemployed people that we have. So somehow we have to get more people to come off the sidelines than we have seen so far. And that's not so clear exactly how that's going to happen. So we have, I haven't gone into it in these slides, but you've got retirees, you've got a group of people when the pandemic came along, they were more at risk from the disease. Their nest egg looked pretty good. The value of their house was high. The value of their savings was high. They were going to retire anyway. A lot of people said, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and retire. I don't think those people are likely to come back in very quickly. And then you've got two earner couples where one person was staying at home and you had kids or other issues, take care of a loved one during the pandemic. They said, some of those couples said, well, we'll have one person stay at home. Those people, we know their job finding probabilities and they're coming back into the labor force, but that's a very slow process. That takes, it's like a lifestyle adjustment, and it depends, where their kids are at or where their loved one is at or whatever. And so that process takes a long time. So we are pulling people back into the labor force, but that's a slow process. And not something that's occurring at the high enough frequency to help us on the inflation dimension. Let's put it that way. So yes, all those things will occur over the next 3 to 5 years, but we've got inflation today, and we got to do something about inflation today. So anyways, I'm rambling on about it, but I do think it's a sensational labor market from the point of view of somebody that's been marginalized and is looking for work. This is a great time to get out there and get a match, or encourage somebody that that has had trouble maybe in labor markets to get the right match now, because you could get it now and set yourself up for the next 5 years or more.
But
Yeah.
under either of your interpretations, in terms of where the Fed rate may need to be, it's clear the market's not yet priced that in. So there still seems to be some disconnect. I'm curious, do you think part of it is the market's still trying to absorb the magnitude of inflation, or this whole transitory, non-transitory? How do you think about that disconnect?
Yes, I try to avoid the word that must not be stated. Transitory. So the last summer, so really what's interesting about the inflation process here is that if I was giving this talk 1 year ago, I would have been pretty confident inflation was 2% and was going to stay at 2%. we would have had a few numbers that suggested something else, but basically not enough to write home about. And I would have come here and said, talked about how great Fed policy was and everything. But then we got in March, April, May, June of last year, we got these high inflation numbers. And then we started to tell this transitory story. I think it actually, at that point, it wasn't too bad a story to tell. The vaccines had come in, the economy had started to reopen, booming times, but still some supply chain problems. It actually was a good story to tell. So maybe we just have some inflation in those months right there, but inflation go right back to 2%. And even into September, October, this is a blink of an eye in macroeconomics, right? So the months and quarters are what we deal in, but everything was fine. Then you got the October inflation report. Not only did inflation not come down, it took a step up. Then you got November up again, December up again, January up again. And I think recently the chair said, I think that story's been blown out of the water. Maybe he didn't use that word, but so it's really just in the last 5 or 6 months that you've got this kind of holy cow kind of feature to the inflation that we really have to get on. And combined with the policy rate being all the way down at 0, it wasn't like the policy rate was 2% or 3%. And we had to go higher from there. We were still all the way at 0. So this confluence of events has really put us in a tough position. We're really going to have to move now to get this under control.
President Bullard, you've talked a lot about the FOMC and your national role, but let's talk about the 8th District for a minute. We have a lot of local bankers here. So what surprises you about the area economy? What keeps you up at night? What are our particular strengths? We know that the middle of the country is not like the coasts. And so talk a little bit about what you see ahead. Yeah. All right. Well, to go with that. Let's talk a little bit about what our local people here should be thinking about, what they can be taking out of this whole confusing scenario that's bringing down the markets again for a third day. So, but let's talk about the 8th District economy.
Absolutely. So the labor markets are even stronger in the 8th District than they are in the nation as a whole. And I think that reflects, very strong economy in the district. The bankers that we talk to are flush with deposits. They're doing very well. However, the market for loans is very competitive, and margins could be coming under pressure here. So that's been a concern that we've certainly heard. We do have a CDAC council, which Community Depository Institutions Council, that we convene, twice a year. And then the chair of that goes on to DC and gives our advice from the 8th District that way. I really do think more broadly about the Midwest. I do think that the Midwest is America's best kept secret. I think it's a very well-off region with a very strong economy. So I think this idea of the coast is a little bit of a misnomer. And the reason I think that is there's now data available about cost of living in different MSAs around the country. And sure, you might have a place that has higher nominal incomes, but they also have higher cost of living. So you have to take the cost of living into account when you're looking at who's successful and who's less successful. So if you look at the MSAs across the country, you look at the top 10, 4 of them are in the Midwest, 3 are on the West Coast, and 3 are on the East Coast. So the Midwest wins. But it's not enough just to have a low cost of living. You have to have a combination of good jobs and a diversified economy combined with relatively low cost of living. And if you put those two together, you'll get really, really good economic outcomes. So, so I think this is the coastal idea. And by the way, in that calculation that I did, it's available on my webpage. I did it with some co-authors. The biggest cities, the glam cities are not the ones necessarily that do the best. New York is down the list. Chicago is down the list. Los Angeles is down the list. And some of the southern cities are bright, sunny places, which I love, but they're also down the list. So it's not at all clear, unless you consider cost of living, that you've really got the right idea in your head about who's successful and who's not successful. I will say in that study, the San Francisco does come out on top. And San Jose, which is right next door, also comes out on top. So that's number one and number two. But Silicon Valley is a special once in a lifetime or once in a century or once in 500 years phenomenon. You've just got this tremendous amount of innovation and explosion of ideas coming out of there. And it's been commercially fantastically successful. That doesn't happen every day. That happens once in a blue moon. So I don't think that can be the benchmark, is just, we want to be, the Bay Area. They've done very, very well. It's probably not going to be replicated, but the Midwest does very, very well, abstracting from that part.
Hi.
Yep.
In the context of government spending, what is your response to congressmen, politicians that advocate modern monetary theory, MMT?
Yeah, I think modern monetary theory, I haven't seen the model yet. So for me, it's show me the model, and I haven't seen it. So to me, you have to write something down that is at the same level as what would go into an academic journal, and make some arguments and make an argument that it makes sense. I haven't seen that. So it's not so clear to me exactly what they have in mind about inflation.
You mentioned earlier that inflation hits low and middle income families the hardest. I wonder what your thoughts are on monetary policy mitigating some of those harms.
Well, I think the low and moderate income people are hit the hardest. So right now, what's happening is that nominal wages are increasing. And so people think, great, I'm getting a raise, but it's not keeping up with inflation. So they're actually worse off. And some of that happened in the 1970s as well. So I think policy, we've got the right goals. I think we want to do two things. You want to keep inflation low and stable so you don't have this problem. You don't want this high and variable inflation that is very harmful. And at the same time, of course, you don't want to be in recession. So you want the expansion to go on for a long time. So this is the art of central banking, is exactly that can we get inflation to be low and stable? Can we play our cards right so that we keep the expansions going for a long time? We actually had a lot of success in the 1980s with a very long expansion, again in the 1990s with a very long expansion, again in the 2000s to some degree, but then we got hit with the global financial crisis, and that was a big punch in the face, I would say. But even this last expansion before the pandemic, that went on for 10 years with low and stable inflation. There were other aspects of that were kind of slow. But if you look at the earlier era in the post-war era in the US, you had a lot more recessions. If you look at the late 19th century, you had a lot more recessions. The economy bounced up and down all the time. So I think in some ways we have been successful. We've had these longer expansions, but boy, it's can be tough going, I'll tell you. So
President Bullard, if we can dig into that even a little more. I was talking with one of our community partners right before with Columbia Housing Authority. And so they work to get low-income families in poverty into houses, and they have a serious backlog of not finding affordable housing. Do you have thoughts on the outlook for what some are calling an affordable housing crisis?
Outlook for, sorry.
Affordable housing?
Yeah. Well, I'm a little, I'll be a little bit grim here. I'm a little worried about it because house prices are a place where they have gone up dramatically right through the pandemic here. I think the pandemic itself shifted demand for housing. People want, if they're going to hang out at home as much as they have been, they want more space, they want a nicer place, they're willing to pay more for that. So the demand has shifted and the supply has had trouble keeping up. And this is definitely pricing some people out of the market, or maybe a lot of people out of the market. So I am concerned about this. I just saw a chart this morning about Canada. Canadian prices are up 50% year over year. Can you believe it? I mean, so I'm concerned that we're feeding into that process. I think you'd like that to be a more stable. We all want our houses to be valuable and everything, but we do have to trade houses sometimes. And so you'd like this to be a more stable process. You'd like the construction process to be just the right one that handles the influx into the housing market and keeps some of the housing affordable for all parts of the income distribution. So I have to say, though, I am concerned about it.
I was just curious about your thoughts on the national debt.
I think we're good for it. The national debt was ramped up a lot in response to the pandemic, and I'll say a couple things about that. I think if there was ever a time when maybe you should use your power and your ability to borrow on international markets in order to stabilize the economy, that was probably it. So, okay, March, April 2020, and subsequently, we did borrow a lot and used it. Now, that means you got to pay it off in the future. It looks right now like the share of income that we have to devote to service the national debt is not particularly high, so that's encouraging. So far, it's not coming back to bite us. I think the debt to GDP ratio is declining because the economy has grown so quickly and recovered so fast. So we're actually getting some decline at this point. So it's way up, but it is declining a bit. And I do think the policy was the pandemic policy in a macroeconomic sense. There's tons of human tragedy around the pandemic, I understand. And we all know people that were sick or died during this pandemic. But the macroeconomic response was very strong, both on the fiscal side and the monetary policy side, and very successful, I would say. You could have, in the spring of 2020, you could have had a financial crisis on top of the pandemic. And I think the Fed's actions helped, and the fiscal policy helped mitigate the shock to the economy. The recession was only 2 months long. It was super steep. It was only 2 months long. Then you started to recover right away in May of 2020. You did not get this financial panic on top of the pandemic that you could have had. And then we were off to the races by the third quarter of 2020. So I think it was the right thing to do, but it does saddle us with some debt going forward. That's for sure. Yeah.
Given inflation and growth running for the past years and also moving forward at a higher level than what is expected and what has been the average, is it still fair to expect the neutral rate of the neutral rate to be the same level that we've seen over the last decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea of a neutral policy rate has built into it the idea that inflation is 2%. I showed you some charts. Inflation's not 2%, is way too high. So should we be thinking of an even higher neutral policy rate? And I think that would feed into this calculation. So that would be something to look at. I tried to get this idea of these generous assumptions and the minimal level of where you'd have to be. And even with that comes out to 3.5%. But this would be an argument that it's higher than that.
What are your thoughts on cryptocurrency?
Crypto. Did you have anything specific in mind? I actually went to the Coinbase conference in the spring of 2018, I believe. And I talked to an audience there about crypto. It was a phenomenon, I would have to say. If I recall correctly, Jamie Dimon was being burned in effigy outside of the hotel. So it kind of tells you what the attitude was. I felt like the Christian being fed to the lions. There's about 3,000 people in the audience. So I said a lot of things there that I would stick by. That talk is called Non-Uniform Currency and Exchange Rate Chaos, but it brought ideas from monetary economics and monetary theory to the crypto guys. The crypto is kind of more computer science and less monetary economics than I would like. What I would say about crypto is that it's a private currency issuance, and we haven't allowed private currency issuance in the United States since before the Civil War. We did have this period before the Civil War when almost all the banknotes in circulation, 90%, were issued privately. So you would have a bank like Bank of America notes and JP Morgan notes and Wells Fargo notes, and these would all circulate around, but they circulated around at different exchange rates. And so people didn't like this. You would go in to buy your, you'd ride into town on your horse, and you'd go into town to buy your whiskey, but you weren't sure if you had Bank of America dollars, how much whiskey you were going to be able to buy with this. So there were actually books, and people had to look through the books to know how much to discount the different currencies. That's called a non-uniform currency system. And people didn't like it. And when you got to the Civil War, the Congress passed a Uniform Currency Act, meant a dollar is a dollar. So I think the same thing is unwittingly happening today. You've got this concept, it's not quite happening yet, but you go into Starbucks and now you're going to pay in dollars. You might pay in, Bitcoin, you might pay in Ether, whatever the flavor of the day is, but those prices are going to fluctuate against each other, and you're not going to be sure which thing to pay with. And so I think this idea of non-uniform currency is not a good one, but it's one that we're drifting toward by allowing this private currency issuance to occur. So I'm not quite sure what the end game is here for it, but there's a lot of other comments in this direction in that talk. I think I'm being dragged off stage.
We got one more, maybe.
No.
Okay, hopefully I got a quick question for you.
Sure.
But as you mentioned, there was an increase in early retirees. Given our age demographic trend, what are your thoughts on the potential future age for retirement, or perhaps the individual income tax rate?
Yeah. I think the country could do a lot better in managing demographic factors instead of letting demographic factors happen to us. And I think you could use immigration policy actually to stabilize the population growth rate. And I think that would be a great thing to do. You could also use immigration policy to control the distribution across the age distribution. So you could allow more people in that were younger. If you didn't have enough younger people, then you'd allow more in younger. That's what people say now, right? We have too many retirees, not enough young people. So, so you could fix the age distribution, and you could have your immigration policy tied to the incoming cohort of 20-year-olds. Those are kind of the people that are about ready to enter the workforce. And then you would make sure that between those two things, you always had 2% growth of the workforce. I think that would be a fantastic policy. But because immigration is so intensely debated and it really cuts across political lines, and we're not sure what to do, but maybe we could rally around that idea as a way to rationalize our immigration policy in the U.S.
Thank you. President Bullard, thank you so much for being so gracious with your time and all the Federal Reserve staff who helped put this event on. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks for being here today. This was a lot of fun, and I hope to do it again soon.
Thank you. And we'd thank you all as our community partners. So Veterans United, Commerce Bank, Callaway Bank, Bank of Missouri, and Central Bank, and then all of you for coming. I'll just mention real quick that even though our center is in the College of Business, we have an extension land grant mission. And so that means not just teaching students on campus, but doing outreach and things in the community. And so we hope to do more of these and stay in touch. Thank you.